On an unassuming, chilly Sunday, October 6th, Philadelphia, a 17-year-old steps out into the harbor. With the smell of fresh water and fresh beginnings, a witty, wry, humored, and charming Benjamin Franklin arrived in the city of brotherly love. However benign this scene seemed to him in the beginning, it would be the start of many people's fascinations and intrigue with the characters, or many characters, of Benjamin Franklin. And what I mean by different characters of Benjamin Franklin is the various facets and the various different things he did within his life. If we are to really truly understand the man on the $100 bill, we have to look at all the facets of his life, all the characters he had, or all the different things he did. He was an inventor, a diplomat, printer, one of the greatest minds the world has ever come to know. However, I do want to give a disclaimer before we do look at Benjamin. Understand that Franklin is one of the most complicated characters to fully grasp in a short-term video. So I do recommend it if you really do want to get a full picture of Benjamin Franklin. I would recommend reading any of his biographies or his autobiography, or the main one I recommend, if more for a modern look, is Walter Isaacson's. But to fully grasp the person of Benjamin Franklin takes way more than just this simple video. So I do recommend doing that, and I appreciate it. Let's get into it. January 17th, 1706. On Milk Street in Boston, on another Sunday, Benjamin Franklin was born to Josiah Franklin and Obiah Folger. He was one of 17 children that his father had. Boston was becoming livelier than ever, and its population doubled every year. At the time, it was one of the premier harbors and one of the best places for commerce and commercial goods. And it was really just the place to be if you were to be in any type of business. It was the center for commerce and Puritan values, a place where Benjamin Franklin would grow up. During his childhood, he was a very avid swimmer, even to the point where he made his own devices so he could move faster through the water, which these were kind of like flaps, paddles, whatever you want to call them. They kind of look like what we have today with scuba gear. And at one point during his childhood, he ran across a boy who had a whistle, and he was immediately intrigued by what the device was. He was around 5 or 6 at the time, and he immediately gave him all the coins in his pocket for it. And when he returned home, his siblings probably rolled around on the floor laughing at him because he paid 4 times the amount it was worth. This is probably what made Benjamin Franklin so frugal as he was, if we really want to pinpoint it. Because what he says about it, when he recalled it, he said, "He cried with vexation, and the reflection gave me more chagrin than the whistle gave me pleasure." When he was around 6, they moved out of their 2-room house to a larger house on Hanover and Union Street. It is where, in 1712, his favorite sister, by his own account, Jane, was born. And it was after that they had gotten a little bit better with their finances and in a better place with this, that his father decided that he needed his son and he wanted his son to be educated. So he was sent to the Boston Latin School, where he was the top of his class and was jumped a grade ahead. This path was never meant for Franklin. The plan for him was to become a minister. But as his father started to see, his son really wasn't cut out for ministry. He was too curious, he was very puckish, he was skeptical, he was inventive, and he didn't seem that interested. I said fucking interested. He didn't seem very interested. So instead of ministry, he was sent to a tutor named George Brownell. And he was more businesslike, he was a lot more hands-on with things, and it would be the perfect fit for Benjamin Franklin. Of course, from early on, he showed excellent skills in writing, but he failed math. So if you're like me, there is still some hope out there, right? And at age 10, he became apprentice at his father's soap and shop candle. What the fuck did I just say? Okay. At age 10, he became an apprentice at his father's soap and candle shop. This only lasted for a couple days, and then he went to work with his uncle making knives and blades. As Walter Isaacson points out in the biography, this is probably where Benjamin Franklin got such an appreciation for craftsmanship and people who were leather apron. So keep that in mind. At age 12, in 1718, he became an apprentice for his brother, who was a printer. Now, I do want to stop before we get into any more of his details. And I want to point out something that is so remarkable about Benjamin Franklin. So, Benjamin Franklin, as I've covered, didn't have much, he had little to no schooling, maybe 2 years. I mean, he had things here and there, but he is mostly self-taught. And what is so remarkable, as he's one of the greatest diplomats, negotiators, businessmen, and inventors, and someone who just truly understood human nature to its very core and its fundamentals, and yet he was self-taught. He is one of the greatest examples of someone that even if you have little schooling, you have little of this, high school diploma, you can still become one of the greatest people of your time. The business as a printer was natural to Ben. As he recalled, "From a child, I was fond of reading, and all the little money that came into my hands was ever laid out in books." And his brother had some books here and there, but it was a very modest collection. However, Benjamin Franklin could still recall some of the most important books that his brother had. One of these was Plutarch's Lives, which he read abundantly, and it was Daniel Defoe's An Essay Upon Projects, and then also Cotton Mather's Essays to Do Good. But however, he wouldn't just read his brother's books. He would also sneak books from other apprentices or boys he knew that worked with booksellers, and he would sneak them and read them. Recalling this event, he said, "I often sat up in my room reading the greatest part of the night, when the books were borrowed in the evening and to be returned early in the morning, lest it should be missed or wanted." During this time of him, borrowing books and studying all through the night, Franklin would teach himself how to write in various styles. And he would use a lot of words that he wasn't familiar with, and he would write in a poetic style, he'd write in an essay style, and it's what he really became good at. And soon, this love for writing and writing in different styles would lend him what became a great change in fate. So at the time, he would watch his brother and his friends write these little essays that they would print in the New England Courant, which was his brother's paper, they were like these anonymous submissions. Anybody could submit them. Benjamin wanted to get a piece of the action, but he knew his brother would be very jealous if he knew he was writing these. So one night, he wrote an essay and disguised his own writing, and he slipped it under the door of where he was working. And the next day, the people at the print shop were enthralled with this crazy writing from this widowed woman or what it seemed to be a widowed woman who was middle-aged, who wrote by the pen name of Silence Do Good. And they were so enthralled with it that they put it on the front of the next paper that week, and which was on April 2nd, 1722. And thus, this character of Silence Do Good was born. Now, these these essays became very popular in Boston, and Franklin was posing as this widowed, prudish, middle-aged woman who lived in a rural area, and she would criticize everything from politics to religion, which was didn't go too well once his brother found out it was him. He was only 16 when he was acting as this middle-aged woman, and he kind of unknowingly shaped that homespun sense of humor that early humor was like. Biggest example would be Mark Twain, but he kind of unknowingly created this, and he had multiple characters throughout his life. Another example would be Poor Richard. I mean, that's probably the biggest one, but yeah, it's interesting to see. At 16, he did such a thing. Now, what he did when he created these characters and why they were so successful, really, was because they were funny and they were very relatable. But he would do it, he would talk about really serious subjects, but he would make it funny. And it was almost like this mocking type of thing, and they're still entertaining to this day to read. It was kind of his way of getting his point across without making a lot of fuss. Because Benjamin Franklin, even from an early age, he wasn't big on, conflict. There were some founding fathers that were kind of like made for, like John Adams, but he was more of a reserved type. And this is what kind of shows that side of him. But it was really useful. But by the fall of 1722, his ideas for science do-good were starting to run dry. And his brother was starting to catch on. He'd kind of probably see these little things and like, wait a minute, that sounds like my little brother. And after his 13th submission, he revealed that he was Silence Do-Good all along. And as I foreshadowed earlier, it didn't go too well, because a lot of the times he'd be mocking religion, and it caused a lot of turmoil, and I think, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, but pretty sure his paper was getting threatened to being taken down or being fined for this. His brother was not having any of it. So Franklin decided he needed somewhere that was big enough for his characters, or his own character. So convenient a thing is it to be a reasonable creature, since it enables one to find or make a reason for anything one has a mind to do. To get on a boat at 17 and just go to a completely new place. No money, nothing. It's incredible. And he only had a Dutch dollar and a shilling in copper. He ended up giving the shilling of copper to the boatman who journeyed him there. And then with the other money, he bought bread, but he ended up giving the bread to a mother and a child, which it's funny that he had no money, but he still gave it away. He had a quote on that somewhere, but I didn't put it in the script or anything. And he soon found a place to rent from John Reed, whose daughter actually was amused when Benjamin Franklin arrived. She was very amused by the sight of this young man prowling around, just fresh off the boat. And as a young tradesman, he thrived in this new environment, and he befriended many. He got into many social circles, as he was almost recreated. He was almost reborn during this time. And at the time, he befriended the governor of Pennsylvania, Sir William Keith. And the story of how he befriended this guy is very interesting. As one of the times, Governor Keith's, one of his friends or family, showed him a letter from Benjamin Franklin, and he was immediately enthralled with this writing. He was like, who is this guy? I need to find who this kid is. In which he immediately went to Keimer's shop. And the owner was surprised. He's like, what was the governor doing here? And he was even more surprised when he asked for Franklin. And he was much enthralled with Franklin because of his talent. So they went for a drink. And he offered him to help him set up his own printing shop, in which he would receive the Providence's official business. And he would send a letter to his father. The governor would send a letter to his father for funding. So with this letter from the governor, he returned back to Boston to show his family. And they were delighted that he was even alive, because, he just kind of left. They didn't even know where he was going. However, again, his brother was once again a little bit jealous. And he would later. Franklin would learn how to deal with this jealousy from other people. But we'll get into that later. But for now, Franklin was full of himself and his new status. And Cotton Mather invited him over for a chat. And as they were making their way through a narrow passage, Cotton Mather called up, "Stoop, stoop." And Benjamin Franklin ended up bumping his head on a low beam. Cotton Mather, being a genius probably, he turned the mistake into an insight. And he told Franklin, "You are young. Stoop as you go through the world, and you will miss many hard bumps," which this is something that Benjamin Franklin carried with him throughout his entire life. And sadly, after his time in Boston, his father refused to fund his startup. So Governor Keith pledged that he should go to London and would pay for the equipment he needed. But when he got there, those letters of credit that Governor Keith supposedly wrote, they were fake. So now he was stranded in London for almost 2 years. Governor Keith did this on many occasions. He would make these outlandish promises, but he would really never fulfill them. So Benjamin Franklin just happened to be another victim of this. And it cost him 2 years. And he went around working in various printing shops in London, which probably actually was in the end, it was probably useful because he learned all these different tricks and tips from them. But it took him almost 2 years to get the money to go back to America. And finally, he was able to establish the Pennsylvania Gazette. And over the next couple of years, he'd create newspapers, magazines, almanacs. And he was able to create franchises throughout the colonies. And it went through other cities. And eventually, he would almost encompass the entire postal system. Now, if you want an example of someone who is an ingenious businessman and networker, I would recommend you look into his business career. As in such a short time, he was able to create this giant printing business. Now, I do recommend looking into that, but if I was to include all that, this would be a very long video. I would recommend the Founders podcast. He has a great episode on Benjamin Franklin. So yeah, I'd recommend that. In September 1730, Franklin was very well off in business, but he was looking for a wife. But he was looking for a wife that was more virtue focused, someone who was frugal and practical and pragmatic like himself. So he found his good and faithful helpmate, which was found in Deborah Franklin. Which this marriage of practicability and deep romance would last for almost 40 years. However, there was a kind of self-proclaimed problem that was kind of, at the time, it wasn't seen as a very good thing. And it was in 1730 to 1731, we don't truly know. In April, William Franklin was born. It was a result of Franklin's own words of dealing with low women, as he called it in his autobiography. And it wasn't a very good move on his part, but, it is what it is. Nevertheless, he did take full custody of William, and the relationship was a rocky one throughout his entire life. Now, Benjamin Franklin's political career was perfectly set up for him for what was to come later in 1776 in the American Revolution. But first, I want to cover some of the small things that he just truly captures some of the most important things, some of the most interesting things that we have today. So with the Junto, a club, this is kind of a club for self-improvement, and it included a lot of businessmen around the area. They focused on improving social goods and just things to help the community around them. And firstly, in 1731, they founded the Library Company of Philadelphia. And here we can learn, while he was establishing the Library Company, another important lesson from Franklin. He found that people were not so eager to support a prosper of any useful project that might be supposed to raise one's reputation. So his solution to this was to remove himself as much as I could out of sight and giving the credit to others. And it is a lesson that he used time and time again, and I believe that we could use in our own lives. His comment on this was, when people find out that it was you, he suggested to not claim it, as the present little sacrifice of your vanity will afterwards be amply repaid. And what's cool is the Library Company is still alive today with over 500,000 books and 160,000 manuscripts. A testament to Franklin's presence even in our modern day. However, his reach would go way beyond just the Library Company. He also started the Union Fire Company, which he was active in until I think 1743. He also started a voluntary militia in 1747 in King George's War against the Spanish and French privateers. And in 17, also during this time, well, not around that time, but a little bit later, in In 1751, he founded a school which would end up becoming Pennsylvania University. Going back a little bit more, in 1748, after a bunch of this community work was taking much of his time, he retired from the printing business at 42. Now, probably unbeknownst to him, this would only be one half of his life. And the greater part and the greatest impact he would have on society as a whole would come in the next part of his life. But before we move into the second half of his life, I did compile some things that I found were very interesting and useful I believe we can take note of. And these are just some of the lessons he used and things he considered that were virtuous. So one of the first ones is, he said, do not talk constantly about your own knowledge, education, and success. That's pretty straightforward. I would like to also point out that he had this kind of virtue checklist that he would do. They're pretty interesting to read because some of them he didn't fully follow all the time, but I guess it was just a way to keep himself in check. So the list includes temperance. He said, eat not to dullness, drink not to elevation, silence, speak not, but when may benefit others or yourself, order, let all your things have their places, resolution, perform what you ought, frugality, make no expense but to do good, industry, lose no time, sincerity, use no harmful deceit, justice, wrong none, moderation, avoid extremes, cleanliness, tolerate no uncleanliness, tranquility, be not disturbed, do not disturb others, chastity, 13, humility, imitate Jesus and Socrates. Now, one of these things that he learned, and what I was talking about with him dealing with jealousy, he had 3 rules for basically what he believed would defeat jealousy. His first rule was self-deprecating humor. The next one was unpretentious demeanor. And the second was unaggressive style and communication. Even as a young man, he loved to create things, build things. It was his passion. And what's really interesting about him being such an inventor was he never even put a single patent on his inventions. He believed that they should be free use for everyone, and if someone can improve on his designs, they can gladly do so. He cared for making things that were useful and practical, and something that would make the lives of people just a little bit easier. For example, in 1744, he created a stove that would heat rooms more effectively. However, it was a little bit too complex, and if your fire went out, smoke would fill the room. So his first design wasn't the greatest, but it was later improved on. However, some of these smaller things were not really what he was known for, but he was mainly known for being, as the French would later call him, the tamer of lightning. And this mainly started on a visit in 1743 when he's entertained by a showman named Dr. Archibald Spencer, who performed these scientific tricks, and one of them including taking static electricity by rubbing a glass tube and drawing sparks from a boy hanging from silk cords on the ceiling. And Franklin was extremely intrigued with this. And so sometime in 1747, he started experimenting himself. He would collect electric charge and then have his friends touch the spinning glass tube, and they would touch each other to see what would happen. And his findings were as such. We say B is electricized positively, A negatively, or rather B is electricized plus and A is minus. A lot of these neologisms that he used, we still use today. And the funny thing is we still use a lot of the words he coined. He created the words battery, charged, condense, conductor. All of these things came from his experiments. But of course, most notably was probably his of course, the key in the kite experiment, which was in 1752. But during this time, his scientific discoveries would have to be put on hold. And he turned his attention to something a little different. He was to be involved in politics. Now, I'm also going to summarize his political career before 1776, But there are very important things that we must understand, mainly in his early ideas on government and other things for the colonies. Even from an early age, he had a big aversion to established authority, and it was just ingrained in him. And of course, we see this in his assessment of religion in Silence Dogood and his ideas of classes. He was not awed by anybody's status. He treated you the same whether you were king or beggar. He believed strongly in the middle class, as he's basically he's like the representation of the middle class. He was a shopkeeper, he was a craftsman, and he believed anyone was able to rise to what they dreamed of, regardless of where they came from. And his ideas were really based on a meritocracy. His whole political career was basically summed up by the philosophy of being practical, which is why he's one of the most influential political theorists of all time. His important role in any kind of political role or sense came in 1751 when he became a member of the Pennsylvania Assembly. And according to Walter Isaacson, there was two things that shaped his career and the future of our nation. First, he became extremely against the British, of course, and if you couldn't guess why, it was mainly because of their control of taxes over the colonies. And second, he wanted to get the colonies working together for common purposes, which of course led to independence later. One of these things that he did that he was trying to unite the colonies under some type of government was the Albany Plan in 1754. And at the time, the French and Indian War had erupted, and the concern was how would they defend themselves against this. So a bunch of representatives came to New York, and the purpose was to create a unified central government for the colonies, which was headed by Franklin. It was kind of a skeleton of what our nation would become. And you could kind of see the resemblance. Like, the only differences was that they'd have like a general president, and that was elected by the crown, and then a legislative branch who would control taxes and westward expansion. Of course, this was rejected because obviously they just didn't want us to have that type of that much independence, especially over taxes and future expansion. The concern was over individual rights, as it just seemed that the colonies, the people that lived in America, were just kind of treated second hand compared to British citizens. And it was really what the foreground of what the spirit of the colonies was heading towards. On May 5th, 1775, Franklin landed on the Bay of Philadelphia. Bells rung, and many were waiting for his arrival. And much of what happened over the course of the years, to summarize before, Franklin arrived in London, which he lived there for some years from 1757 to 1775, where he was representing Pennsylvania. And a lot of things he did, or one of the main things that happened, was he was mocked in the British Assembly. And it just kind of solidified that, yeah, we're probably going to have to move away from British control. And some other notable events during this time was Deborah had died a year before, which they were separated because she feared traveling over the sea. He never came to her funeral or anything, and it caused kind of some problems in the family. He was 69 years old, and he returned mainly, as I mentioned before, that he realized Britain was not willing to repair or repeal anything that had led up to that point, like the Intolerable Acts or the Tea Act, things like that. And he joined a group of men that would include John Hancock, Jefferson, John Adams, Patrick Henry. That was the Second Continental Congress. And during the Continental Congress, it's important to note that Benjamin Franklin was the oldest and usually the quietest, as when members would go to the tavern to drink. A lot of the founding fathers were big drinkers. He would just go home. And they were kind of like, all right, this guy. Like John Adams complained one time that he was just sitting in silence a great part of the time, fast asleep in his chair. And Benjamin Franklin was kind of the mildest. He had the mildest temper. He was a little bit older, but he just wasn't into the yelling and debates. He was just kind of more reserved. However, his passion for the American cause was no less, and his influence was arguably the strongest, and mainly because the nation needed a backbone. And the Albany Plan, proposed in 1754, really planted the seeds of what and how the nation could come under a union and move beyond that. The system was a little different than what was to come, but it was still the early seeds of the union that was needed. And of course, our independence didn't come until 1776, when Franklin, Jefferson, and Adams created the Committee for the Declaration of Independence, and Franklin edited much of the document. An example of one of these important changes to Jefferson's draft would be the sentence. Originally, it said, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable," to which Franklin changed it to, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," and it was kind of drawn from John Locke's philosophy, which Benjamin Franklin and Jefferson were both big fans of him, so it just made it a little bit stronger. We kind of know the rest of the story of 1776 and how the 13 stars aligned, but I want to kind of cover something a little bit different from 1776, which was in 1777 when the Articles of Confederation were made or ratified. And they were drafted between 1776 in June till November of 1777. And it was like this early constitution, but it was more of what they called it. It was kind of framed as a league of friendship between the states. And it was mainly authored by John Dickinson, but it had major influences from Franklin. And what's interesting to note is Franklin's almost forward thinking in this document. Like, one of the things he proposed for this was the proportional representation, which was removed of course it was removed for the one state, one vote at the time, but it just shows how forward thinking it was, because obviously this was later adopted. But moving back to 1776 again, there was much to be done, and mainly with our foreign alliances. And we needed a lot of supplies, help, and money, and France was the main aim. And there was really only one person that was up for the job. He was chosen for multiple reasons, and it was kind of an obvious choice. He was probably the most famous American at the time, but he was also a diplomatic genius. This would be the hardest obstacle that Franklin would ever have to face. So on October 27th, 1776, Franklin left for France. Within his hands lay the entire American cause. Everything that led up to this point was really dependent on Franklin. And after a long journey through the French countryside, on December 2nd, he arrived in Paris. And his intentions were, he kind of wanted to keep a low profile when he was going there, but he was kind of surprised at how popular he was. People were lined in the streets to see the world famous Franklin. People were just mad over Franklin. Like, they adopted his style of his fur cap that he wore when he went over there. And they printed medallions, rings, portraits. And a lot of these times, these portraits were hung in their houses. Like, that's how famous Franklin was at the time. His face was almost more popular than the king himself, which was kind of annoying to King Louis, but he was kind of also intrigued by Franklin himself. The Tamer of Lightning, as they named him, it was like a staple to them. It was like they're almost foaming at the mouth for his presence. And John Adams even commented on this. He said, his reputation was more universal than that of Frederick or Voltaire, and his character was more loved and esteemed. But how did Franklin create such an air around him and people wanting to, like, literally hanging his portraits up in his house? This was on purpose, obviously, because Franklin, he just knew how to capture people's attention, and he knew how to craft a reputation for himself. He knew the French had a fascination with Quakers, and they saw people from America as rustic, wild, and people who were pioneers. And he really played to this. He dressed plainly and he always wore his fur cap. It was like the symbol of an explorer, a pioneer, someone who's very rustic. He almost came off as this backwoods sage, but also a philosopher of the age. But of course, many of the French diplomats knew that he wasn't just visiting or, coming to say hi to some friends. He was there for a single purpose. He wanted America to be recognized as a nation. And it was becoming very difficult, or he knew it was going to be difficult because of how the war was going back then. For example, in 1777, in September, he and many other commissioners pushed Vergennes to receive aid, but Vergennes didn't bite, and news of Lord Howe taking Philadelphia was mainly the reason. Thankfully, though, on December 4th, a messenger arrived to tell Franklin that the Battle of Saratoga, which if you know anything about that, was very pivotal. It was a very pivotal battle. Franklin framed it as Howe was now isolated, which of course was not true at all, but nevertheless it did work. And soon King Louis invited them to resubmit allegiances with France, and he was open to an alliance with America again. On December 7th, Franklin delivered the new appeal for the alliance, and within weeks it was accepted. And America now had the French as a friend. But it wasn't really fully realized until March 20th, when the commissioners were received at Versailles. In the court of kings and people of power, it's cool to see that a lowly printer, this representation of the middle class, shifted the balance and power of history. It was like a bridge between monarchy and republic. Shortly after this pact was made, came John Adams. He was sent as a new commissioner in April, and it caused a lot of turmoil, just to say the least. Now, I do have a video on John Adams if you do want to know more about that. But all you need to know for now is John Adams was removed, and Franklin could continue his talks with the French in peace. But, of course, John Adams would return later in 1780 for the same result, and probably a little bit worse. And of course, John Adams was removed again a little bit later. But during this time in 1780, or towards the end of 1780, America was in need of money badly, and Franklin had to do something. So in February 1780, using every appeal he could, he sent a letter to Vergennes, writing about his age and his illness and him getting close to retirement. And he warned that if the American cause was lost, Britain would become a terror of Europe. And he asked for 25 million livres, which is about equivalent to $130 million in the US today. So this wasn't a very small ask. And in the end, he did only receive 6 million, but it was still enough to keep hope going. And in 1781, Franklin did want to resign, as his health was declining, and he just had this need for retirement. However, the Congress wanted to keep him there for one simple reason. They had one more job for him. If the war came to the end, he was going to be one of the people that would negotiate peace. He was one of 5 commissioners if the war came to the terms with Britain, but he knew if no victory was won across the pond, that there would be no terms with Britain. And thankfully, in October of 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. The Battle of Yorktown was the final piece that was moved for us to gain our independence. The negotiations began in 1782, and Franklin was laying on a razor's edge. As France wanted certain terms and Britain wanted different ones, it was a fine line he had to balance. After a long game of balancing interest, in 1782, on November 30th, Franklin and others met with Richard Oswald, the British negotiator, to sign for peace. And he left out the French. Now, this wasn't, obviously you could probably guess, that did not go very well. And they gave him the job of talking to Vergennes about it. And of course, he was able to persuade them and kind of cool the tensions down. But as we know, Franklin had to do what he had to do, and he had just accomplished one of the most important things in our nation's founding. He stayed in France for a little bit longer, and he enjoyed the company of French, but with his gout and kidney stones, ill health prevented him from crossing for a little longer, but he finally was able to return in America on September 14th, 1785. He arrived back in Philadelphia, and it had been 62 years since he had arrived there when he was 17 years old. And now that he was back home, there was still a lot to do. One of the main things he did, he was elected as the president of Pennsylvania, and he later attended the Constitutional Convention, in which he kind of acted as this mediator. And he tried to remind everybody and to keep in mind that we were trying to become a unified government. But sadly, his health was starting to decline, and in his final speech, Delegate James Wilson had to read his speech. And in this speech, he kind of explained that he didn't fully approve of the new Constitution, but he still saw it as a work of art that did still create a nation of sovereign states. And he also acknowledged that obviously there's no convention that could ever make a perfect document, but it worked for now. And as he left the final session, a woman asked him, "What had the convention actually done?" And he responded with, "A republic, madame, if you can keep it." And after all these sessions, after all this work, he would serve a third term as the Pennsylvania president, but he knew his time was soon to come. And in April of 1790, he lay in his bed with chest pains, a bad cough, and he laid in bed for several days. Sadly, the abscess burst in his lungs to where he couldn't speak anymore. Benny, his grandson, approached the bed as his grandfather reached out his hand. At 11 p.m. that evening, April 17th, 1790, Franklin died at the age of 84. The man of many characters, the negotiator, the tamer of lightning, had finally passed beyond. More than 20,000 people gathered for him to be lowered beside Deborah. However, there was one last message from the sage. He had written this epitaph or something to be engraved over his stone, and it reads, "The body of Benjamin Franklin, printer, like the cover of an old book, its contents worn out and stripped of its lettering and gilding, lies here, food for the worms. But the work shall not be lost, for it will, as he believed, appear once more in a new and elegant edition, revised and corrected by the author." Franklin was one of the greatest men to ever live. And his life was so full, it was really hard to capture the full essence of his person. As you can see, I did summarize a lot of points. And again, I recommend reading a biography on him. And if this simple video wouldn't do his full life justice. I mean, this pragmatic, frugal, charming, he's just a case of someone who fully and truly understood human nature to its core. And he was someone who was always full of life. And what I believe makes him so remarkable, and this is something I believe we can all take notes on, is just his remarkable spirit. He never lost his curiosity, that jovial, childlike essence, and he never stopped challenging himself. He was never stuck in his old ways, and he was never known as the grumpy old man. He was a man who saw the wonder and the beauty of the world he shaped with his characters, or the world that he fully observed around him. And I believe it is something, and he is someone that we should study throughout our entire lifetime. And that, my friends, is the case of Benjamin Franklin. Until next time.